small village in Africa, something new and exciting has arrived. For the first time, these people have the chance to access the internet, and with it, countless possibilities. But they're the lucky ones. Most Africans have never even seen a computer, let alone had access to the internet. Actually, the truth might shock you. According to global internet statistics on broadbandsearch.net, 12.8% of the world's internet use comes from Africa, while North America only uses 6.8%. That's far from the common idea that most Americans and others around the world have about Africa and its people. Turns out it's not the techno-illiterate place that we've been sold. And this is a common problem that Africa has faced ever since the first Europeans took an interest in it. When you think Africa, you probably think exotic animals and wide open spaces. You probably think of huts and remote villages. While these things definitely exist, they're not the norm, especially today. This year, Africa's combined population has reached 1.3 billion, and it's expected to hit 2.5 billion by 2050, and 43% of them are now living in urban settings. Compare that to North America, where the total population is 368 million, with a huge 82% living in urban areas. 82% of 368 million comes out to 301.7 million. Africa's mere 43% gives it 575.3 million. That means they have more people living in urban areas than the total combined population of North America. And with the rapid growth that Africa's been seeing, those numbers will only continue to go up. Now you might be asking, what does all this have to do with internet access? I'm glad you asked. Urban areas are by far the biggest internet consumers. In Africa, where build-out of infrastructure has been slow and difficult, that trend is even more pronounced. According to Budcom research, dedicated broadband connections still only make up between 2 and 10% of all internet usage in Africa. So how are Africans accessing the internet? Smartphones. Depending on the market, mobile devices on cellular networks account for between 90 and 98% of all internet connections in Africa. In fact, before smartphones arrived on the scene, Africa's internet usage was extremely low. When they did arrive, Africans basically leapfrogged over old technology that they never had access to. But boy, do they have access today. Mobile network infrastructure has even jumped ahead of other development. A report by Afrobarometer in 2016 found that only 30% of Africans had access to toilets, while 93% had mobile phone service. But how can that be true? Smartphones are expensive, right? And Africa's poor, right? Well, yes, and yes. Last year, 422 million Africans were below the poverty line. That's 1/3 of the total population. So how are they getting access to phones? Have you ever heard the term made in China? Chinese entrepreneurs have been filling the African market with cheap knockoff smartphones for years. And while their quality leaves a lot to be desired, many who would otherwise need to go without have found them to be adequate enough. And that's not the only contribution that China is making to Africa. Both national and private Chinese organizations have been investing heavily in African infrastructure. They've been funding developments of African telecommunications infrastructure since 1990. While they're not the only contributors to be bringing internet access to Africa, they're definitely one of the biggest. Even though internet access hasn't reached the kind of saturation across the population of Africa that we see here in the United States, it might not be long before they overtake us. As a whole, Africa has a very young age structure. That means that there are huge amounts of kids currently growing up all over the continent right now. If most of them now live in urban areas with access to the internet already, just think of when they all grow up and have children of their own. With those kinds of numbers, African infrastructure will need to continue to grow rapidly just to keep up.